Friday evening, the rehearsal dinner. Claire stands frozen outside the heavy oak doors, staring through glass at the candlelit dining hall. Michael laughs with his bride, surrounded by everyone she used to know. Her hands tremble. She's seconds from running back to her car when a deep voice speaks behind her. "Don't let them see you're hurt." A tall man in charcoal suit steps beside her, offering his arm with quiet authority. "Walk in with me. I'll be your shield tonight." She can't breathe, can't think. Only feels his solid presence and the choice before her: run or trust a complete stranger. Hours earlier, she'd been certain this was a mistake. The drive north had taken 5 hours. Claire gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as coastal fog rolled across Highway 1. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in the cup holder. Messages from her mother, her sister, reminders that everyone would be watching tonight. Each notification sent her stomach twisting tighter. She turned onto the private road leading to Willowmere Manor, and nausea hit hard. The historic estate sprawled across manicured grounds overlooking the lake, stone terraces and mullioned windows glowing warm against the gathering dusk. Luxury cars lined the circular drive. Couples in expensive clothes moved toward the entrance like they belonged there. Claire pulled her modest sedan into a spot far from the entrance and sat very still, hands trembling in her lap. Through the windshield, she could see them. Michael's friends, his new colleagues, the bride's family. All the people who would watch her walk in alone, their pity sharp as knives. She'd confirmed 3 months ago, back when she still believed she could handle this with dignity. Back when the wound was fresh enough that pride mattered more than pain. Now, sitting in her car in a dress she'd owned for years, watching couples stream toward the manor's entrance, she understood the truth. She wasn't strong enough for this. The humiliation wouldn't be subtle. It would be public, witnessed, remembered. Her chest tightened, throat burned. She reached for her keys. That's when she saw him. A man stood near the entrance, tall and still amid the movement around him. Dark blonde hair, sharp suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, hands in pockets as he watched the manor's doors with an expression she recognized instantly. The same trapped look she felt clawing at her chest. He turned slightly, and pale blue eyes found hers across the parking lot. For 3 seconds, neither moved. Then he walked toward her car with deliberate steps, expensive shoes crunching gravel. Claire's heart hammered. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he was approaching, but something in his face, some shared understanding of dread, kept her from starting the engine. He stopped beside her window, waited. She lowered it halfway. "You look like you're about to run," he said quietly. His voice was deep, controlled, with an edge of something raw beneath the polish. "I am," Claire admitted. He crept up her neck. This was a terrible idea. The wedding. Coming to it, he studied her face with unsettling directness. Ex-groom, something shifted in his expression. Not pity. Understanding, then, we have that in common. "My ex is inside too," bride's friend Claire's breath caught. She searched his face, found the same carefully controlled pain she'd been hiding for 6 months. "I'm sorry, don't be. I'm considering the same escape route." He glanced toward the manor, jaw tight. "But running gives them exactly what they want. Proof we're still broken." The words hit harder than they should have. Because he was right. Michael wanted this. Wanted her to fail. To prove his choice was justified. Leaving now would hand him that victory on a silver platter. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to walk in there alone," she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he smiled. Not warm, not kind, but real. "Then don't walk in alone." Before she could process what he meant, he opened her car door and offered his hand. "One night, we walk in together, stay through dinner, give them nothing to gossip about. Then we never have to see each other again." Claire stared at his outstretched hand. This was insane. She didn't know this man's name. Didn't know anything except that he understood exactly how she felt and was offering her something she desperately needed. A shield, a buffer. A way to survive this with some fragment of dignity intact. She took his hand. His palm was warm, grip steady, as he helped her from the car. "Nathaniel Ashford," he said. "Everyone calls me Nate. Claire Donovan." "Well, Claire Donovan." He offered his arm, ready to face the firing squad. She slipped her hand through the crook of his elbow, felt expensive fabric and solid muscle beneath. Not even a little good. "Neither am I." His voice dropped lower. "But we'll do it anyway." They walked toward the manor together, gravel crunching under their feet. Something about her quiet courage made his chest tighten. Why did protecting a stranger feel more important than protecting himself? With each step, Claire felt eyes turning toward them, curious, assessing. She forced her spine straight, chin up, even as her pulse raced. Nate's presence beside her felt anchor-solid. He didn't rush, didn't flinch. Just walked with quiet authority that made her feel, for the first time in 6 months, like maybe she wasn't completely alone in this. They reached the entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the dining hall beyond, candlelight, flowers, Michael standing with his bride, looking happy and certain, and completely moved on. Her hands started trembling. Nate felt it. His free hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, palm warm against her cold fingers, steadying the tremor she couldn't hide. "Don't let them see you're hurt. Walk in with me. I'll be your shield tonight," he murmured. Just for her. Claire looked up at him, found those pale blue eyes watching her with something fierce and protective. A stranger. A man she'd met 3 minutes ago. Offering her exactly what she needed when she needed it most. She nodded, couldn't speak. Could only trust. Nate opened the door and let her inside. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Willowmere Manor's breakfast room. Claire sat alone at a small table near the terrace doors, nursing coffee that had gone lukewarm. Around her, wedding guests filled round tables draped in ivory linen, voices bright with the easy chatter of people who belonged here. She didn't belong last night, had proven that spectacularly. Dinner had been excruciating. Michael's pitying glances across the room, his bride's mother asking pointed questions about Claire's charming teaching job, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Nate had stayed beside her through all of it, steady and protective, but she'd seen the strain in his jaw. The cost of maintaining the charade. When dinner finally ended, he'd walked her to her room without a word, just squeezed her hand once at her door and disappeared down the hallway. She hadn't seen him since. Claire pushed scrambled eggs around her plate. The wedding ceremony was this afternoon. Reception tonight. Brunch tomorrow. 24 more hours of this performance, and she wasn't sure she could survive it, stranger shield or not. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up. Nate stood beside her table, holding a coffee cup, dressed in casual navy sweater and dark jeans that somehow looked more expensive than most people's formal wear. His blonde hair was slightly damp, like he'd just showered. Those blue eyes met hers with quiet question. "It's yours if you want it," Claire said softly. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The morning sounds of the breakfast room filled the silence. Silverware on china. Low conversation, someone's phone buzzing insistently. "How are you holding up?" Nate asked finally. "Barely." Claire set down her fork. "You?" "Same." He took a slow sip of coffee, gaze drifting toward the terrace, where early guests had gathered to admire the lake view. "My business partner cornered me after you went upstairs. Wants to discuss selling the estate again." The words were casual, but tension radiated from his shoulders. Claire studied his profile, the tight set of his jaw, hands gripping the coffee cup just slightly too hard. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That sounds difficult. It's necessary." His voice went flat. "The shipping business isn't what it used to be. My father built something solid, but markets change. Holding on to legacy for sentiment's sake is foolish." He didn't believe that Claire heard it in every controlled word. This was a man convincing himself of something that broke his heart. "Is that what you think?" she asked. "Or what someone told you to think?" Nate's eyes cut to hers, sharp and startled. For 3 seconds, he just stared at her. Then something in his expression shifted, the polished mask cracking just enough to show the exhaustion beneath. "Does it matter?" he said finally. "Either way, the numbers don't lie." Before Claire could respond, movement near the entrance caught her attention. Michael had entered the breakfast room with his bride, both glowing with pre-wedding excitement. They moved through the space like royalty, accepting congratulations, laughing at jokes, perfect, untouchable. Michael's gaze found Claire across the room. His smile dimmed slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. He said something to his bride, then started walking toward their table. Claire's chest tightened. Not now, not this morning. She wasn't ready for his pity. His condescension disguised his care. Nate must have sensed her tension, because his hand moved across the table, covering hers. The touch was deliberate, visible. "Acclaim, breathe," he murmured. "I've got you." Michael reached their table, smile firmly in place. Claire, good morning. His eyes flicked to Nate's hand over hers, then back to her face. I wanted to check in, make sure you're comfortable. I know this weekend might be difficult for you. The words were kind, the tone was condescending, like she was fragile, broken, someone to be managed with gentle concern. I'm fine, Michael, Claire said evenly. Thank you for asking. Good, that's good. He shifted his weight. I wasn't sure you'd come, honestly, but I'm glad you did. It means a lot that we can still be friends. Friends as if they'd simply drifted apart instead of him destroying her with calculated cruelty 6 months ago. Nate's thumb moved across her knuckles. Small, grounding. We should catch up later, Michael continued. There's someone I want you to meet. Another teacher. I think you two would really connect. Heat flooded Claire's face. He was trying to set her up. At his wedding, like she was a charity case needing help finding someone new. That's thoughtful, Nate said before Claire could respond. Voice pleasant and cold. But Claire's schedule is full this weekend. We have plans. Michael's gaze sharpened on Nate, really seeing him for the first time. Taking in the expensive clothes, the confident posture, the protective way he held Claire's hand. I don't believe we've met Nathaniel Ashford. Nate didn't stand. Didn't offer his hand. Just met Michael's eyes with level calm. Are you, together? Michael asked, looking between them. Yes, Nate said simply. Claire's heart hammered. The lie was out now, public and witnessed. No taking it back. Michael's expression flickered. Surprise and something else, before the smile returned. Well, that's wonderful. I'm happy for you, Claire. Really, he didn't sound happy. He sounded confused, maybe even slightly threatened. I should get back. Big day ahead. But we'll talk later. He walked away. Claire watched him rejoin his bride, saw them exchange quiet words, saw the bride glance back at her table with new interest. That was masterful, Claire whispered. Nate released her hand slowly. He's exactly what you described. Needs to believe you're still suffering to validate his choices. You saw that too? I've met 100 men like him. Bitterness crept into his voice. They measure their worth by what they've acquired and who they've left behind. Claire studied his face. Your ex did that to you. It wasn't a question. Nate's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Victoria left me for someone who offered more. More excitement, more ambition, more everything I apparently wasn't. He picked up his coffee cup, 3 days before our wedding. She said I was emotionally unavailable. Then married my competitor 6 months later. The words were delivered with careful control, but Claire heard the wound beneath them, raw and unhealed. I'm sorry, she said softly. Don't be. She was probably right. He stood abruptly. I should go. The ceremony starts in a few hours, and I need to make some calls. But he didn't move. Just stood there looking at her with something complicated in those blue eyes. Regret, maybe. Or recognition. Thank you, Claire said. For last night, for this morning, for not making me face Michael alone. Nate's expression softened, just barely. You didn't need me, Claire. You would have handled him fine, no, she said honestly. I really wouldn't have. He smiled then, small and real. Meet me in the lobby at 2. We'll walk to the ceremony together. Then he left, taking his steady presence with him, leaving Claire alone with cooling coffee and the strange warmth of knowing someone understood exactly how she felt. The wedding ceremony was held in Willowmere Manor's garden, under an arch of white roses overlooking the lake. Afternoon sun broke through scattered clouds, casting golden light across rows of elegant chairs filled with guests in summer finery. Claire sat near the back beside Nate, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm like they'd been doing this for years. It felt terrifyingly natural. Michael stood at the altar in perfectly tailored tuxedo, watching his bride walk down the aisle with an expression of absolute certainty. No doubt, no fear, just complete conviction that this was right. Claire's chest ached. She'd never seen that expression on his face during their relationship. Never inspired that kind of certainty. Nate's thumb brushed her wrist, subtle grounding. She glanced at him, found him watching the ceremony with carefully neutral expression, but his jaw was tight. His ex Victoria sat 3 rows ahead, elegant in rose silk, whispering something to the woman beside her. You okay? Claire whispered. Fine. His voice was controlled. Flat you. No, the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. Honest, I appreciate that. The ceremony began. Traditional vows. Promises of forever. the bride's voice clear and confident, Michael's resonant with emotion. When the officiant pronounced them married, applause rippled through the garden. The newlyweds kissed, then walked back down the aisle hand in hand, radiating joy. Claire forced herself to clap, forced her face into something resembling happiness, but inside something crumbled, because Michael had moved on, completely genuinely. And she was still here, pretending with a stranger just to survive being in the same room as him. "Come on," Nate murmured, as guests began standing. "Let's get out of here before the receiving line forms." He guided her through the dispersing crowd, hand firm on her lower back. They made it halfway across the garden when a familiar voice stopped them. "Nate, is that really you?" Victoria approached in a cloud of expensive perfume, smile bright and sharp. She was stunning, Claire noted with sinking stomach. The kind of beautiful that made other women feel instantly inadequate. Nate's voice went carefully neutral. "I didn't know you'd be here." Victoria's gaze slid to Claire, assessing and dismissing in one smooth glance. "And who's this?" "Claire Donovan," Claire said, extending her hand. "Nate's girlfriend." Victoria's smile tightened just barely. She shook Claire's hand with cool fingers. "How lovely. I didn't realize you were seeing anyone, Nate. It's been, 18 months since we last spoke?" "Something like that." "Well," Victoria's eyes gleamed, "I'm glad you've moved on. You look happy." The words dripped with false sweetness. Nate's hand on Claire's back tensed, pressure increasing just slightly. "We are," Claire heard herself say. "Very happy. That's wonderful. Really." Victoria tilted her head. "What do you do, Claire?" "I teach elementary art." "Oh. How sweet." The condescension was almost invisible, wrapped in a smile. "That must be so rewarding." "Working with children it is," Claire said evenly. "I'm sure." Victoria turned her attention back to Nate. "We should catch up later. There's so much I'd love to hear about. How the business is doing, whether you've made any progress on expanding the shipping routes." Her smile sharpened. "Or maybe you're still in the same place." The words landed like small knives. Nate's expression didn't change, but Claire felt him go rigid beside her. "The business is fine," he said flatly. "Of course it is." Victoria touched his arm lightly. "I didn't mean anything by it. I just worry about you sometimes. You put so much pressure on yourself to maintain your father's legacy. I hope you're not sacrificing too much for sentiment." There it was. The real message beneath the concern. "You're not good enough. You're failing. I was right to leave." Claire's protective instinct flared hot and sharp. Before she could think, she stepped closer to Nate, her hand sliding up to rest against his chest in a gesture of casual intimacy. "Nate doesn't sacrifice anything," she said quietly. "He protects what matters. There's a difference." Victoria's eyes narrowed just slightly. "I'm sure you're right. You must know him so well." "I do," Claire said. The lie came easily now. "Better than most people." "How long have you been together?" 4 months, Nate answered, his hand covering Claire's where it rested on his chest. The touch felt deliberate, possessive. "We met through mutual friends." 4 months. Victoria's smile turned calculating. "That's still quite new. The honeymoon phase. Everything feels perfect." "It does," Claire agreed. "Strange how that happens when you're with the right person." The words hung in the air between them, sharp-edged and deliberate. Victoria's mask slipped for just a second, revealing something cold beneath. "Well," she said brightly, "I should get back. The reception starts soon. It was lovely meeting you, Claire. I'm sure we'll see more of each other this weekend." She walked away, hips swaying in expensive silk. Nate released a slow breath. He started, then stopped. "Thank you." "She's horrible," Claire said quietly. "She's exactly what she's always been. I just didn't see it before." His hand was still over hers, warm and solid. "You didn't have to defend me." "Yes, I did." "Why?" Claire looked up at him. "Because she was trying to make you feel small. And you're not." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise maybe, or confusion. Like he wasn't sure what to do with her honesty. "The reception's starting," he said finally. "We should head inside, Nate." He stopped, waited. "This arrangement," Claire said carefully. "The pretending, what exactly are the rules?" His blue eyes met hers. "What do you mean?" "I mean, how far does it go? Do we just stand near each other? Hold hands occasionally? Or do we actually try to convince people we're together?" Nate studied her face for a long moment. "What do you want it to be?" "I don't know," Claire admitted. "But Victoria's going to be watching. And Michael. They'll be looking for cracks." If we're going to do this, we need to be convincing. Convincing, he repeated slowly. What would that look like? Like we actually care about each other. Claire's heart hammered. Like we're comfortable together. Not just tolerating each other's presence. Nate stepped closer. His hand came up to brush a strand of blonde hair from her face. The touch gentle and deliberate. Like this, Claire's breath caught. Yes. Like that, then that's what we'll do. His voice dropped lower this weekend. We're together, completely convincing. No cracks, no weakness. His thumb traced her cheekbone. And when it's over, we go back to being strangers. Agreed, Claire whispered. His hand fell away, but the warmth of his touch lingered on her skin. Come on, let's show them exactly what they're missing. They walked toward the manor together, and something between them had shifted. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was protection, partnership. Two wounded people building a shield strong enough to get them both through the weekend intact. Claire just hoped her heart would survive the pretending. The reception hall glowed with candlelight and fairy lights strung across exposed beams. Round tables filled the space, covered in ivory linens and centerpieces of white peonies. A string quartet played softly near the dance floor, while guests mingled with champagne flutes and easy laughter. Claire stood near the bar, watching couples drift past. Her feet ached in heels she'd worn for exactly this occasion, and her face hurt from smiling. Nate had disappeared 10 minutes ago to take a phone call, leaving her exposed and visible. Michael's mother approached with calculating smile. Claire, darling. So good to see you. The woman's eyes swept over Claire's simple dress. And who was that handsome man you arrived with? My boyfriend Nathaniel. How lovely. What does he do? He manages his family's shipping business. Oh. Interest sharpened in the woman's gaze. Maritime Holdings the Ashfords. Claire had no idea, but she nodded anyway. Well, Michael's mother smiled wider. That's quite an upgrade from Michael, isn't it? Good for you, dear. The words stung more than they should have. Like Claire's worth was measured by who she dated rather than who she was. She opened her mouth to respond when Nate's hand settled on her lower back, warm and steady. Sorry about that, he murmured. Business never stops. He nodded politely to Michael's mother. Ma'am, Mr. Ashford, what a pleasure. The woman practically glowed. We were just discussing your family's company. His thumb moved in small circles, against Claire's back, a gesture so casual and intimate it made her pulse jump. But we managed. Michael's mother launched into questions about shipping routes and Pacific trade. Nate answered with polite detachment, but Claire felt tension building in his shoulders with each word. This wasn't comfortable for him. This performance of success while his business crumbled behind the scenes, she shifted slightly, pressing closer to his side. His hand tightened on her waist, grateful. When Michael's mother finally excused herself, Nate exhaled slowly. You okay? Claire asked quietly. I hate this, he admitted. Everyone looking at me like I'm something I'm not. You're not pretending to be something you're not. You are who you are, am I? His voice went rough. Because, right now, I feel like a fraud. Standing here in a suit I can barely afford anymore, talking about a business that's failing. Pretending I have my life together when everything's falling apart. Claire's chest ached at the raw honesty. She turned to face him fully, hand coming up to rest against his chest. The gesture felt natural now. Necessary. You're not a fraud, Nate. You're just human. He looked down at her, blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I haven't felt human in a long time. Before Claire could respond, the lights dimmed and the band's music shifted, the first dance. Michael led his bride onto the floor, and they moved together with practiced grace, lost in each other's eyes. Claire's throat tightened. She'd imagined this moment once, her and Michael dancing at their wedding. It felt like a lifetime ago. Let's get out of here, Nate said suddenly. What? Just for a few minutes. I can't watch this. His hand found hers, fingers threading through hers with surprising gentleness. Please. Claire nodded. They slipped out through the terrace doors into cool evening air. The lake stretched dark and still beyond the garden, moonlight painting silver paths across its surface. Music drifted through the windows behind them, muffled and distant. Nate walked to the stone railing and gripped it with both hands, shoulders tight. Claire followed slowly, giving him space. My father used to bring me here when I was young, he said quietly. Willowmere Manor. He had business dealings with the family that owned it. I'd run through these gardens while he talked contracts and shipping routes. His voice went rough. He built something real, something that mattered. And I'm watching it die because I can't figure out how to save it. Claire moved beside him, close enough their shoulders almost touched. You're trying? That counts for something, does it? Because from where I'm standing, trying isn't enough. He turned to face her. Everyone keeps telling me to sell. Cut my losses, move on. Like 30 years of my father's work is just property to liquidate when it becomes inconvenient. It's not just property to you, Claire said softly. No. The word came out broken. It's all I have left of him. Without thinking, Claire reached for his hand. He gripped it immediately, desperately, like she was the only solid thing in his collapsing world. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't be dumping this on you. We barely know each other. Maybe that's exactly why you can tell me. Claire squeezed his hand. Sometimes it's easier to be honest with someone who doesn't have expectations. Nate's thumb brushed across her knuckles, the touch absent and searching. You surprised me, Claire Donovan. How? You're stronger than you think you are. His eyes met hers. Walking in there tonight, facing your ex, defending me to Victoria. That takes courage. I was terrified, I know. I could feel you shaking. His free hand came up to cup her face. Touch, gentle and grounding. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is. Claire's breath caught. They stood so close now, his hand warm against her cheek, her heart hammering against her ribs. The moonlight turned his blonde hair silver, his blue eyes dark and intense. We should go back, she whispered. They'll notice we're gone. Let them notice. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I don't want to pretend right now. Isn't that all we're doing? Pretending? I don't know anymore. The confession came out raw and honest. This morning at breakfast, when you saw through my excuses about the estate. Tonight, when you defended me to Victoria. It doesn't feel like pretending. What does it feel like? Nate's jaw tightened. His hand fell away from her face and he stepped back. It feels dangerous. Like I'm starting to forget this isn't real. The words hit Claire like cold water, because she'd been thinking the same thing, feeling the same pull toward. This stranger who somehow understood her better than people she'd known for years. It ends Sunday, she said quietly. After brunch, we go back to our lives. That was the agreement, right? Nate's voice went flat again, controlled the agreement. He offered his arm, she took it. They walked back inside together, back to the music and laughter and careful performance. But something had shifted between them, something neither was ready to name. And Claire was starting to realize that pretending with Nathaniel Ashford felt more real than any relationship she'd had in her entire life. Sunday morning arrived with pale sunlight and the promise of a long day ahead. Claire found Nate in the manor's library, standing by tall windows that overlooked the garden. He wore dark jeans and soft gray sweater, coffee cup in hand, looking at nothing in particular. She knocked softly on the doorframe. He turned, and something in his expression eased when he saw her. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Too much on my mind. He gestured to the second cup on the side table. I brought you coffee. Wasn't sure how you take it. Black is perfect. Claire crossed to join him, accepting the warm mug. Thank you. They stood in comfortable silence, watching morning mist burn off the lake. The intimacy of it felt strange and right, like they'd been doing this for years instead of 2 days. I have to meet with my business partner this afternoon, Nate said finally, before the evening festivities. He's pushing hard for a decision about the estate. What are you going to tell him? I don't know. Frustration edged his voice. Logically, selling makes sense. The numbers support it, but he stopped, shook his head. But your heart isn't in it, Claire finished quietly. My heart isn't supposed to matter. This is business. Your father's legacy isn't just business, Nate. He looked at her, blue eyes searching her face. How do you always know exactly what to say? I don't. I just say what I'm thinking. That's terrifying. Only if you're hiding something. The corner of his mouth lifted. What if I'm hiding everything? Before Claire could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Michael appeared in the doorway, still in workout clothes, water bottle in hand. His expression shifted when he saw them together. Morning, he said carefully. Didn't mean to interrupt. You're not, Nate replied, but his posture had gone rigid. Michael stepped into the library, gaze moving between them. Claire, I was hoping we could talk, just for a few minutes. I feel like we haven't really had a chance to catch up. Claire's stomach tightened. We're actually about to head down to breakfast. This won't take long. Michael's smile was gentle, understanding, condescending, please. It would mean a lot to me. Nate's hand found Claire's fingers threading through hers with deliberate possession. If Claire's comfortable, she wasn't, but walking away would look like weakness. It's fine. I'll meet you downstairs in a few minutes. Nate's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He squeezed her hand once, then left the library, leaving her alone with Michael. The silence stretched. Michael closed the door softly. I'm glad you came this weekend, he said finally. I know it wasn't easy. It's fine, Michael. Is it though? He moved closer, expression earnest. Because I've been watching you. You seem tense, uncomfortable, and I just want to make sure you're okay. Heat crawled up Claire's neck. I'm fine. Are you happy with him, Nathaniel? Michael's voice dropped, intimate and concerned. Because from what I can see, you barely know each other. The way he looks at you, it's like he's performing, like you're both performing. Claire's hands curled into fists. You don't know anything about us, maybe not, but I know you, Claire. And this doesn't feel like you. He stepped closer, voice gentle as a knife. You deserve someone who sees you, who appreciates what you have to offer. Not someone using you as arm candy at his ex's wedding. The words landed with surgical precision, hitting every insecurity Claire had been nursing for 6 months. Because wasn't that exactly what she was doing? Using Nate as a shield? Pretending to be something she wasn't? You left me, she said quietly. You don't get to decide what I deserve anymore. I left because you deserved better than what we had. Michael's expression turned pained. I wasn't ready to give you what you needed, but that doesn't mean I stopped caring. Don't. Claire's voice shook. Don't pretend this is about me. You left because I wasn't ambitious enough. Wasn't impressive enough. Wasn't enough, period. That's not true, isn't it? She gestured toward the window, toward the wedding festivities waiting outside. Your bride is everything I'm not. Successful, polished, the kind of woman who fits your new life. That's what you wanted. So don't stand here and tell me you left for my benefit. Michael's mask slipped just for a second. You're right. Sarah is what I needed to move forward in my career. But that doesn't mean I wanted to hurt you. The admission should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it just made everything hurt more. Because he'd confirmed what Claire had always suspected. She'd been traded in for an upgrade. Simple as that. I need to go, she whispered. Wait. Michael touched her arm. I'm sorry that came out wrong. I just worry about you, Claire. You're too trusting. Too kind. And men like Nathaniel Ashford, they don't end up with women like you unless they're getting something out of it. The condescension in his voice. The assumption that she wasn't good enough for someone like Nate sent rage flooding through Claire's veins. You're wrong, she said quietly. Nate's with me because I see him, not his money, not his legacy. Him. And maybe that's something you'll never understand. She walked out before he could respond. Heart hammering, hands shaking with anger and hurt. She made it halfway down the corridor before Nate materialized from an alcove, jaw tight with controlled fury. I heard, he said flatly. How much? Enough. His hand found hers, grip almost painful in its intensity. He's a bastard, Claire. Everything he said about you, about us, it's projection. He needs to believe you're not good enough because admitting he made a mistake would destroy his perfect narrative. What if he's right, though? The words tumbled out before she could stop them. What if I am too trusting? What if you were just using me? Nate went very still. Then he cupped her face with both hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. I'm not using you. This arrangement, this pretense, it's helping me as much as it's helping you. But what's happening between us? He stopped, swallowed hard. What I'm starting to feel, that's not pretend, Claire. And it terrifies me. Her breath caught Nate. I know. It was supposed to be simple. One weekend, then done. His thumb brushed her cheek. But you keep surprising me. Keep seeing through my defenses. Keep making me want things I thought I'd given up on. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. What things? Connection, trust, the possibility that someone could want me for who I am instead of what I have. His voice went rough. I don't know what to do with that. Me neither, she whispered. They stood in the corridor, his hands on her face, her pulse racing. The pretense had crumbled somewhere between last night's terrace and this moment, leaving something raw and real and terrifying in its place. We should go to breakfast, Nate said finally. But he didn't move, didn't let go. Yes, Claire agreed. But neither of them moved. Finally, Nate pressed his forehead to hers. Eyes closed. One more day. After brunch tomorrow, this ends. We agreed, Claire whispered. But neither of them believed it anymore. The afternoon stretched lazy and golden. Most wedding guests had scattered to various activities around the estate. Claire found herself walking the garden paths with Nate, their fingers loosely intertwined, conversation flowing easy and natural. They'd been talking for over an hour about everything: his childhood summers on the coast, her students' artwork covering her apartment walls, the way grief changes shape over time but never quite disappears, the small hopes they'd both stopped admitting to. My father used to say the estate was my inheritance, Nate said as they reached a stone bench overlooking the lake. Not just the property, the responsibility, the legacy of taking care of what matters. He sat down, pulling her gently beside him. I think he'd be disappointed in how I've handled it. Or he'd understand that you're doing your best in impossible circumstances. Nate's hand tightened around hers. You have more faith in me than I do. Maybe you need someone too. He looked at her then. Really looked, and something in his expression made her chest ache. When this weekend ends, he started, then stopped. Never mind, what nothing. It doesn't matter. But it did matter. Claire saw it in the tension of his jaw, the careful way he held himself, like he was stopping himself from saying something dangerous. A cool breeze rippled across the lake, raising goosebumps on her bare arms. Without a word, Nate shrugged out of his gray sweater and draped it around her shoulders. You'll be cold, Claire protested. I'll survive. His hands lingered on her shoulders, thumbs brushing the soft fabric. You're shivering. The sweater smelled like him, cedar and something clean. Claire pulled it closer, warmth seeping into her skin. Thank you. Nate's eyes tracked the movement, watching her wrap herself in his clothing with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Then his hand came up, fingers gentle as they tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. The touch was innocent, simple, but the way he looked at her while doing it, the careful reverence in every movement, turned it into something else entirely. I should tell you something, Nate said quietly. About Victoria. About why she really left. You don't have to. I want to. His thumb traced her cheekbone. She said I was emotionally unavailable, and she was right. I kept parts of myself locked away because letting someone see them felt too dangerous, too vulnerable. His voice dropped. But with you, I can't seem to stop myself from being honest. And I don't know if that's because this is temporary and safe, or because you're different from anyone I've ever met. Claire's breath came shallow. What if it's both? Then I'm in trouble. His hand cupped her jaw, tilting her face up to his. Because temporary doesn't feel temporary anymore. They were so close now. Close enough that she could see flecks of deeper blue in his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his gaze dropped to her mouth and lingered there. Nate, she whispered. I'm going to kiss you now, he said quietly. Not for show. Not for anyone watching. Just because I've been wanting to since the moment you took my hand in the parking lot and trusted me when you had no reason to. Okay, Claire breathed. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him. Wanted to know if the connection between them was as real as it felt. His lips brushed hers, soft, tentative, testing. Claire's eyes fluttered closed as warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't the performative kiss she'd expected. This was gentle and searching, like he was asking a question he didn't have words for. She answered by leaning closer, hand coming up to rest against his chest. His heart hammered beneath her palm, racing as fast as hers. The kiss deepened slightly, still careful but gaining certainty with each passing second. Then Nate pulled back, breathing unsteady, forehead resting against hers. That was, he started. Yeah, Claire agreed, voice shaking. They sat in silence, hands still entwined, foreheads touching. The kiss had changed something fundamental, made the pretense impossible to maintain, made the truth undeniable. We're making a mistake, Nate whispered. This can't go anywhere. You know that, right? I know tomorrow this ends. Tomorrow, Claire echoed, but neither of them moved apart. Neither wanted to face what tomorrow would bring. So they sat on that stone bench overlooking the lake, wrapped in each other's warmth, and pretended that one more day could somehow be enough. Evening fell soft and purple across the estate. The post-wedding dinner was smaller, more intimate. Just close family and friends gathered in the manor's private dining room. Claire sat beside Nate at a round table near the window, hyper-aware of his thigh, pressing against hers, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. Everything felt different after the kiss, charged, inevitable. Across the table, Victoria watched them with calculating interest. Michael sat 2 tables away, occasionally glancing their direction with furrowed brow, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Dinner dragged on, speeches, toasts, the clinking of crystal glasses, and polite laughter. Nate's thumb moved in absent circles, against Claire's shoulder blade, the touch so natural she wondered if he even realized he was doing it. When dessert finally ended and guests began dispersing, Nate leaned close to whisper in her ear, "Walk with me. I need air." Claire nodded. They slipped away from the dining room, down quiet hallways, out through a side door that led to a secluded courtyard. Moonlight painted everything silver. A fountain burbled softly in the center, surrounded by climbing roses. Nate stopped beside the fountain, hands in pockets, jaw tight. "My business partner wants an answer by Monday. Sell the estate or he's pulling his investment? That's tomorrow." "I know. What are you going to tell him?" "I don't know." Frustration leaked into his voice. "Every logical part of me says, sell, cut losses, move forward. But your heart's not in it," Claire finished softly. Nate turned to face her, and in the moonlight his eyes looked almost haunted. "I told you about my father, about the legacy, but I didn't tell you why it matters so much." He took a breath. "When Victoria left, when she said I was emotionally unavailable, I believed her, shut down completely, poured everything into the business because at least numbers made sense. At least profit margins couldn't leave you 3 days before your wedding." Claire's chest ached. "Nate, the estate became my anchor, proof that I could maintain something, build something, even if I couldn't maintain a relationship." His voice went rough. "And now I'm losing that too." Without thinking, Claire closed the distance between them. Her hands found his face, thumbs brushing along his jaw. "You're not losing anything. You're making an impossible choice in impossible circumstances. That's not failure. That's courage. It doesn't feel like courage. I know." Her forehead touched his. "But sometimes courage looks like letting go. Like trusting that your worth isn't measured by what you hold on to." Nate's hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his face. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make everything feel less impossible." His eyes searched hers. "I've known you for 2 days, Claire. 2 days, and somehow you've become the only thing that feels real in my entire life." Her breath caught. Nate, he kissed her. Not gentle this time, not tentative. This was desperate and honest. Months of loneliness and fear poured into one moment of connection. Claire gasped against his mouth, and he deepened the kiss, arms pulling her flesh against him. She melted into him, hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, heart racing, every nerve ending alive. This wasn't pretending. This was real and terrifying, and more than she'd ever felt with Michael or anyone else. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nate rested his forehead against hers. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I'm scared of what I'm feeling, of how fast this is happening, of losing this when tomorrow comes." "Me too," Claire admitted. Tears burned behind her eyes. "But I don't want to stop." "Neither do I." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Stay with me tonight. Not for show, not for anyone else. Just," he stopped, swallowed hard. "Just be with me," Claire's heart hammered. She should say no, should protect herself. This was moving too fast, too intense. Tomorrow, they'd go their separate ways, and this would end, and she'd be left with a broken heart. But looking into his eyes, seeing the same fear and hope she felt reflected back at her, she couldn't make herself walk away. "Yes," she whispered. Nate exhaled shakily. Then he took her hand and led her back inside, up the stairs to his room at the end of the hall. The door closed softly behind them. He didn't rush, just pulled her close, arms wrapping around her, face buried in her hair. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, finding comfort in simple presence. "Thank you," he murmured against her temple, "for being here, for seeing me." Claire pressed closer. "Thank you for letting me." They moved to the bed eventually, lying fully clothed on top of the covers, wrapped in each other's arms, talking quietly about everything and nothing, sharing the stories they'd never told anyone else, the hopes they'd stopped believing in. Sometime after midnight, Claire fell asleep against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Safe scene. completely terrified of how much this stranger had come to mean to her in such impossibly short time. Nate stayed awake longer, fingers threading through her blonde hair, wondering how he was supposed to let her go when tomorrow came. The next morning arrived too quickly. Claire woke, wrapped in Nate's arms, sunlight streaming through the windows, reality settling over her like cold water. Today was the last day. After brunch, this ended. The pretense, the weekend, everything. Nate was already awake, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning." His thumb brushed her cheek. "How do you feel?" "Terrified of what?" "That this ends in 3 hours and I'll never see you again." Nate's jaw tightened. What if it doesn't have to end? Claire's heart stopped. What? What if we try this for real? He shifted to face her fully. "I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other. But Claire, I haven't felt this alive, this real, in years. And I don't want to go back to the emptiness I had before you." Nate, tears burned behind her eyes. "We live in different cities, different worlds. You're dealing with impossible business decisions. I'm just a teacher who can barely afford her rent. This weekend was magical because it wasn't real life. Then we make it real life." His voice turned urgent. "I'll figure out the business, the estate, all of it. But I can't figure out how to wake up tomorrow without you." Claire wanted to believe him. Wanted to say yes, throw caution away. Trust that 2 days could somehow build a foundation strong enough for forever. But fear clawed at her chest. "What if this is just the honeymoon phase?" she whispered. "What if we try, and it falls apart, and we end up hating each other? Or what if it doesn't?" Nate's hand cupped her face. "What if this is the beginning of something real?" Before Claire could answer, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Once, twice, 3 times. He grabbed it, expression darkening as he read the messages. "What is it?" Claire asked. "My business partner. He's here. At the manor. Wants to meet before brunch." Nate sat up, running hands through his hair. "Perfect timing. You have to tell him something I know." "What are you going to say, Nate?" Looked at her. "I don't know. What would you do?" Claire took a breath. "I'd ask myself what I'd regret more. Selling and always wondering if I gave up too easily, or keeping it and watching it fail anyway. That's not an answer, I know. But I think you already know what you want to do. I am scared." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I need to go handle this. Meet me at brunch. I'll be there." He left. Claire lay in the empty bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her life had completely changed in 48 hours. She'd come here to survive her ex's wedding. Instead, she'd found something she didn't know she needed. And in less than 2 hours, it would all be over. She forced herself up, showered, changed into the last outfit she'd brought, checked her phone, and found 3 messages from her sister, asking how the weekend was going. Claire stared at the screen. How did she even begin to explain? She walked downstairs toward the breakfast room where brunch was being set up. Laughter floated through the doors. Happy voices celebrating love and new beginnings. Then she heard it. A familiar voice, cold and carrying. "I'm just saying, it's odd timing. Nate shows up with some random woman right when his business is failing. Seems convenient." Claire froze just outside the door. Victoria's voice. "What are you implying?" another woman asked. "I'm not implying anything. I'm saying it outright. Nathaniel Ashford is using that sweet little teacher as distraction, as proof he's fine when everyone knows he's drowning." Victoria's laugh was sharp. "Honestly, I feel bad for her. She clearly has no idea what she's gotten into." Heat flooded Claire's face. She should walk away, should ignore the gossip, but her feet wouldn't move. "How do you know about his business?" the other woman asked. "I still have friends at the company. They say he's on the verge of losing everything, the estate, the shipping contracts, all of it." Victoria's voice turned satisfied. "I tried to warn him years ago, tried to tell him sentiment doesn't pay bills, but he wouldn't listen. Too attached to his father's legacy to make smart decisions. That's sad. What's sad is watching him pretend with that blonde girl, like she could possibly understand the pressure he's under, like she's anything more than a weekend distraction." Claire's hands curled into fists. The words cut deeper than they should have, because part of her wondered if Victoria was right. Maybe this whole weekend had been Nate's way of escaping his crumbling reality. Maybe the connection between them was just desperation, disguised as something more. She turned to leave, before they spotted her. made it 3 steps before walking straight into Nate. His face was pale, jaw tight. "You heard, yes, it's not true, Claire, what she said about using you." "It's not true," but doubt had already taken root. "How do I know that?" "We barely know each other, Nate. Maybe this whole weekend was just you running from your problems." "That's not fair, isn't it?" Claire's voice shook. "You're facing impossible decisions. Your business is failing. Your ex is here watching you. And suddenly, you're offering me forever after 2 days that doesn't feel like love. It feels like desperation." Nate flinched like she'd struck him. "So that's it? You believe her over me?" "I believe that we got caught up in something that felt good because our real lives hurt too much." Tears burned her eyes. "But that's not enough to build a relationship on, Claire. I need to go." She stepped past him. "Thank you for this weekend, for being my shield. But it's over now." She walked away quickly, vision blurring. Behind her, she heard Nate say her name once more, broken and desperate. But she didn't turn around. Couldn't turn around. Because if she looked back, she'd see the same pain in his eyes that was tearing her apart. And she wasn't strong enough to survive that. Claire threw her bag into her car's trunk with shaking hands. Around her, the manor's parking lot bustled with departing guests, cheerful goodbyes, promises to stay in touch. The easy endings of people who hadn't just destroyed something precious. She slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. Couldn't make herself turn the key. Couldn't make herself leave while her heart was screaming that she'd made a terrible mistake. But Victoria's words kept playing on loop, using her distraction. Weekend escape. How could Claire trust what she'd felt when everything about the situation was designed for fantasy? When real life pressed in with its complications and impossibilities? A knock on her window made her jump. Nate stood outside her car, face pale, eyes red-rimmed. "Don't do this," he said through the glass. "Please don't leave like this." Claire lowered the window halfway. "I have to. Why?" "Because Victoria planted doubt. Because you're scared. Because this was never real, Nate. It was a performance that got out of hand. You don't believe that?" His hands gripped the window frame. "I know you don't, because I felt what you felt last night. I saw it in your eyes this morning. What's between us is real, Claire. Want different things? You need someone who understands your world. I need someone who won't leave when things get hard. I would never leave you. You don't know that. 2 days ago we were strangers. 2 days from now, we'll be strangers again." She started the car. "Let me go, Nate." His jaw clenched. "What if I can't?" "You have to." Claire's voice broke. "We both have to." She rolled up the window before he could respond, put the car in drive, forced herself not to look back as she pulled away from Willowmere Manor, away from the weekend that had changed everything, away from the man who'd seen her more clearly than anyone ever had. In her rearview mirror, she saw Nate standing alone in the parking lot, hands in pockets, watching her disappear. The image seared itself into her memory. She made it 10 miles before pulling over on the shoulder. Vision too blurred to drive safely. Tears came in wrenching sobs, grief pouring out for the connection she'd found and chosen to walk away from. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nate. Just 3 words. "I'm not pretending." Claire stared at the message until her screen went dark. Then she turned off her phone and drove home through the afternoon light, trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice. It didn't work. 3 days later, Claire stood in her classroom, hanging student artwork on bulletin boards. Bright watercolor flowers and crayon self-portraits. The work of children who still believed the world was kind. She envied them that innocence. Her phone had been silent since Sunday. No calls, no texts. Nothing from Nate except that one message she hadn't answered. She'd thrown herself into work, planning lessons, grading papers, doing anything to avoid thinking about pale blue eyes and the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in her life. It wasn't working. Ms. Donovan, one of her students, Emma, stood in the doorway. "My mom sent me to ask if you need help." Claire forced a smile. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Thank you." Emma didn't leave, just watched her with solemn eyes. "You look sad." "I'm fine." "My mom says people who say they're fine are usually lying to themselves." Claire's laugh came out broken. "Your mom's very wise. She also says sometimes we're scared of good things because we don't think we deserve them." Emma tilted her head. "Do you think you deserve good things, Miss Donovan?" The question hit like a punch to the chest. Claire opened her mouth, closed it, had no answer. "I think you do," Emma said seriously. "You're nice." Leaving her standing alone with the 7-year-old's wisdom ringing in her ears. Did she deserve good things? Or had Michael's words burrowed so deep that she'd started believing she wasn't enough? That connection, like what she'd found with Nate, couldn't possibly be real because she wasn't the kind of woman men chose. She was the kind they left. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Claire's heart jumped before she even opened it. But it wasn't Nate. It was a news alert. A headline about Ashford Maritime Holdings. She clicked it before she could stop herself. Ashford Estate enters emergency sale. Family legacy lost after failed business negotiations. The article detailed everything. The financial struggles of pressure from investors. And the final decision made yesterday. Nate was selling the coastal estate his family had owned for 4 generations. Selling the one piece of his father's legacy he'd been desperately trying to protect. Claire's hands shook. He'd made the choice. The impossible choice. And he'd made it alone. She dialed before she could think. His number rang once. Twice. Voicemail picked up. Nate, it's Claire. I just saw the news. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Her voice cracked. Call me, please. I was wrong about everything. Just call me. She hung up, stared at her phone, waited nothing. That evening, Claire's sister called. Have you seen the video? What video? From the wedding. Someone posted clips on social media. There's one of you and Nate. It's going viral. Claire's stomach dropped. Send it to me. The video appeared seconds later. Footage from Saturday night. Nate and Claire in the courtyard by the fountain. The camera had caught them from a window overlooking the space. Grainy and distant, but clear enough. Claire watched herself reach for his face. Watched him lean into her touch. Watched the kiss that followed. Tender and desperate and completely real. The caption read, "This is what love looks like. 10,000 shares, 50,000 likes." Comments flooding in about the chemistry, the emotion, the way they looked at each other, like nothing else existed. Claire's chest ached. Because the strangers were right. That was love. Raw and new and terrifying. And she'd walked away from it because fear felt safer than risk. She tried calling Nate again. Voicemail again. Voicemail, please. She whispered to the empty line. Please pick up. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I was scared and I pushed you away, and I made a terrible mistake. I don't care about different cities or complicated lives or any of it. I just want you. Please call me back. Hours passed. Her phone stayed silent. Claire curled on her couch, staring at the video on loop, watching the moment she'd found something real and chosen to destroy it. She'd told Nate she needed someone who wouldn't leave when things got hard. But she'd been the one to leave. She'd been the one to run. And now she was alone with the wreckage of her own fear. The truth hit her like cold water. She didn't just deserve good things, she'd found a good thing. A real thing. And she'd thrown it away because she was too scared to believe it could last. But maybe Emma was right. Maybe deserving good things started with having the courage to believe you were worth fighting for. Claire grabbed her keys. It was a 5-hour drive to the coast to Mendocino, to wherever Nate was hiding from his own pain. She didn't have his address, didn't have a plan. But she had the truth burning in her chest, and the determination that she wouldn't lose this without fighting. Done choosing fear over faith. It was time to choose Nate, to choose love. To choose the terrifying possibility that 2 days could build something strong enough to last forever. She just hoped she wasn't too late. The drive north felt endless. Claire gripped the steering wheel as Highway 1 curved along the coastline, fog rolling in thick as dusk fell. She'd called Nate 6 more times. All voicemail. Terror clawed at her throat. What if he didn't want to hear from her? What if she'd destroyed this beyond repair? She pulled into Mendocino just after 9. The small coastal town glowed soft with streetlights, ocean crashing against cliffs in the darkness. Claire had no address, no plan, just a desperate hope and the memory of Nate mentioning his estate overlooked the Pacific. She parked in the town center and started asking. The coffee shop owner didn't know him. The bookstore clerk shook his head. But the woman at the inn smiled sadly when Claire described Nate Ashford Estate, north on Highway 1, about 3 miles past town. You'll see the stone gates. The woman's expression turned concerned. Is he okay? I heard about the sale. I don't know, Claire admitted. I'm trying to find out. She drove north with shaking hands. The stone gates appeared in her headlights, tall and imposing. The driveway wound through trees before opening onto a sweeping vista. The manor house stood against the night sky, all weathered stone and mullioned windows overlooking the dark Pacific. Lights glowed in a few rooms. Claire parked and walked to the front door on trembling legs. Knocked, waited, footsteps inside. The door opened. Nate stood backlit by warm interior light. He looked exhausted, hair disheveled, 3 days of stubble, eyes red-rimmed. When he saw her, he went completely still. Claire, her name came out broken. "What are you doing here?" "I saw the news." "About the estate." Tears blurred her vision. "I'm so sorry, Nate. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I stopped." He stepped forward, jaw tight. "You don't have to apologize. You were right. We barely knew each other. It was too fast, too intense. Walking away was the smart choice." "I don't want to be smart." The words tumbled out. "I want to be brave. I want to take the risk. I want you." Nate's expression cracked. "You can't just show up here and say that." "Why not?" "Because," his voice went rough, "because I spent 3 days convincing myself I could let you go. That what we felt was just heightened emotion from a stressful weekend. That you were right to leave." He stepped closer. Close enough she could see tears shining in his eyes. "And then you show up and all of that falls apart and I'm right back where I started. Wanting something I can't have? You can have it." Claire reached for his face with trembling hands. "You can have me. I want this. Us. I don't care that it's complicated. I don't care that it's scary. I just know that when I'm with you, I feel seen for the first time in my life. And walking away from that was the biggest mistake I've ever made." "Claire," he caught her wrists gently, holding her hands against his face. "I sold the estate. I'm starting over with nothing. I can't give you the fantasy version you saw at the manor. I don't want fantasy. I want you, the real you. The one who's scared and grieving and fighting impossible battles." Her thumbs brushed his cheekbones. "That's who I fell for, Nate. Not the heir, not the legacy, just you." His eyes closed. "You don't know what you're asking for. Then show me. Let me in. Stop protecting me from reality, and just let me be here with you. It's going to be hard, I know. We're going to have to figure out logistics. Distance, real life, I know. I might fail, the business might not recover. I might lose everything. I don't care." Claire's voice broke. "Because none of that changes how I feel. None of that changes the fact that I trust you, that I choose you, that I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Nate's eyes opened, blue and devastated and full of hope. "Say that again," he whispered. "I love you." The confession came easier this time. "I fell in love with you somewhere between the parking lot and the courtyard kiss. And I'd been running from it because it terrified me, but I'm done running, Nate. I'm here. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." He kissed her then, hard and desperate and full of 3 days' worth of grief and hope. Claire gasped against his mouth, arms wrapping around his neck, pouring everything she felt into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, Nate rested his forehead against hers, breathing ragged. "I love you too," he said, "from the moment you took my hand in that parking lot. From the first time you saw through my defenses. I've been in love with you, Claire Donovan. And it's been terrifying and wonderful, and I don't want to do this without you." "Then don't." She kissed him again, softer this time. "Let me in. Let me help carry this. We'll figure it out together." "Together," he repeated, like testing the word. "I'm not used to together." "Me neither." Claire smiled through tears. "But I want to learn." Nate pulled her inside, closing the door against the cold Pacific wind. The interior was beautiful, all hardwood and stone and windows overlooking the ocean. But Claire barely noticed the house. She only had eyes for the man leading her to the couch, pulling her down beside him, holding her like she might disappear. "I have to ask," he said quietly, "what changed between Sunday and tonight?" "I watched the video of us in the courtyard." Claire touched his face, and I saw what everyone else saw. 2 people finding something real. I'd been so focused on all the reasons it couldn't work that I couldn't see the one reason it could. "We want it to, we do." Nate agreed, but wanting isn't always enough. "Maybe not, but it's a start." She kissed his knuckles. "And I'd rather fight for something real and risk losing it than never try at all." Nate's expression softened. "When did you get so brave?" "When I realized what I was giving up." She curled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "A 7-year-old told me I deserve good things, and I decided to believe her." They sat in comfortable silence, wrapped in each other's warmth. Outside, waves crashed against the cliffs. Inside, 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances held tight to the possibility that love could be enough. "I'm selling this place," Nate said finally. "But I'm keeping the cottage, the one my father built when I was young. It's small, nothing fancy, but it's mine. Untouchable by creditors or investors. Can I see it?" He smiled. "Tomorrow? Right now, I just want to hold you." "Deal." They moved to his bedroom eventually, falling asleep tangled together, safe and seen and choosing each other despite every reason this shouldn't work. Because sometimes love wasn't about logic or timing or perfect circumstances. Sometimes it was just about two people brave enough to take the risk. 6 months later, Claire stood in the cottage kitchen watching winter rain streak the windows. The Pacific stretched gray and wild beyond the glass, waves churning white foam against the rocks below. She'd grown to love this view. The raw power of it, the way it reminded her that beautiful things didn't have to be gentle. Footsteps behind her, arms wrapped around her waist, Nate's chin resting on her shoulder. "Morning," he murmured. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep. Too excited." Claire leaned back against his chest. "Emma's class is coming up next week for the marine biology field trip. I've been planning activities. They're going to love it." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're good at this, making education beautiful." Claire had moved north 3 months ago, found a teaching position at the local elementary school. It paid less than her old job, but the classroom overlooked the ocean and her students made art inspired by tide pools and shorebirds. She'd never been happier. Nate had restructured his business. Smaller operation, sustainable contracts. He'd let go of the pressure to maintain his father's exact legacy and built something new instead. Something that honored the past while embracing reality. They'd figured out the logistics, the distance, the messy reality of merging two lives. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. And real was what they both needed. "I have something for you," Nate said quietly. He turned her to face him, blue eyes serious. "Close your eyes, Nate. Trust me." Claire closed her eyes, felt him press something small and cool into her palm. Her eyes opened. A key. Simple. Silver. With a small tag that read home. "I know we've been taking things slow," Nate said. "I know you wanted to be sure this was real before making big commitments. But Claire, you've been living here for 3 months. Your toothbrush is in my bathroom. Your art supplies are all over the dining room table. Your students know this address by heart." His hands cupped her face. "I love you. I want this to be your home, not just where you stay home." Tears blurred her vision. "Are you asking me to move in officially?" "I'm asking you to build a life here with me, as messy and imperfect and real as it gets." He smiled softly. "What do you say?" Claire kissed him instead of answering, poured 6 months of gratitude and love and wonder into it. When she pulled back, she was crying and smiling and completely certain. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Nate lifted her off the ground, spinning her once before setting her down gently. "I love you, Claire Donovan. I love your art projects on my table. I love your students tracking sand through the house. I love waking up with you every morning and falling asleep with you every night. I love the life we're building together. I love you too." Claire touched his face with trembling hands. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost. The ability to trust, to hope, to believe I deserved good things. You've always deserved good things. You just needed to believe it yourself." They stood in the cottage kitchen, holding each other as rain drummed on the roof and waves crashed below. Two people who'd met as strangers at a wedding they'd both been dreading. Two people who'd chosen to be brave enough to let themselves be seen. The path hadn't been easy. Long-distance phone calls at midnight, hard conversations about fears and insecurities, learning each other's rhythms and quirks, building trust slowly, carefully, with intention. But every hard moment had been worth it for this. For mornings in a cottage overlooking the Pacific, for a partner who saw all of her and loved her anyway, for the quiet certainty that she'd found her home in the most unexpected place. "What are you thinking about?" Nate asked softly. "The parking lot that first night. How terrified I was." "Me too, I'm glad we were brave. Me too." He kissed her forehead. "Come on, I'll make breakfast. Then we can work on your field trip plans." They moved around the kitchen together with easy familiarity. Claire making coffee, Nate scrambling eggs, the rain easing to gentle drizzle. A normal morning in their imperfect, beautiful life. Later, after breakfast, they walked the beach together. Cold wind whipping Claire's blonde hair, Nate's hand warm in hers. They talked about weekend plans and upcoming holidays, and all the small details of shared existence. And when they returned to the cottage, tracking wet sand across the hardwood floor, Claire looked at this man who'd offered to be her shield and become so much more. "I love our life," she said simply. Nate pulled her close. So do I. So do I." They'd started as strangers, performing a charade. They'd become partners, choosing each other every single day. And that choice, that daily decision to be brave enough for love, made all the difference. Outside, the Pacific rolled eternal, and it was more than enough. If you made it all the way to the end, please subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. I'd love to hear from you. On a scale of 0 to 10, how did this story make you feel? Drop your rating in the comments. I'll read every single one. I'm truly grateful you're here. See you in the next story.